Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this spinning, fast forward planet wrapped in a pandemic. Uh, Chunks of it on fire, chunks of it submerged recently, as the latest in a spate of Atlantic hurricanes have hit the Gulf Coast. We are facing all kinds of challenges in the communication environment, even as the physical, biogeophysical environment is pushing back on humanity's growth spurt these last 50 years. And today's session of our Friday session on Earth, the Earth Institute, Sustain What webcast is going to focus on the role the media can play, what can be new or different, and how the media address the issues related to climate change and boosting climate resilience, where that's the key factor as well. We've got a great bunch of people here today, and hopefully you out there in the world can weigh in with some questions and comments at the same time. It's been for me and for at least one of our other correspondents here, a very long journey. I do show this sometimes, and I'll show it again. My little museum piece here, because it says some things about this. This was 1988 cover story on global warming. I know a couple of my guests here today have seen it. So 1988, it was 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That was the year Jim Hansen was testifying about the impacts of climate change from humans being in the statistics already. But it was such a complicated reality because back then the prize-winning science magazine had cigarette ads on the back. So we're selling climate concern and tobacco at the same time, and what's interesting to me in reflecting on that is that I don't think in the newsroom we weren't like actively saying, "Hey, we need to walk out of this newsroom. We need to end tobacco silence." And so it was weird. We were operating in a normal system for the media, in which those kinds of complexities were literally on the front and back pages of the magazine. Mark Hertsgaard, who's here today, has been at this a long time as well, through those same decades, trying to make a difference in books and stories. And very notably, a year and a half ago, Mark and a mutual friend, Kyle Pope of the Columbia Journalism Review, launched something called Covering Climate Now, which we'll be talking about because it's pretty much the 1-year anniversary of Covering Climate Now. And we also have today Max Boykoff, who I first got to know in the early aughts, I guess it is, when Max and Jules, his brother, were writing about, they wrote a really pivotal analysis of what they called balance as bias, meaning the media coverage of climate and issues like it. When you do the one hand, other hand thing, you're essentially creating an artificial distortion of the landscape of knowledge around an issue. We also have today Robbie Parks, who's a statistics maven at Columbia at the Earth Institute, and essentially an environmental epidemiologist, trying to kind of figure out these ties between climate change and impacts on public and individual health that can hide in the statistics. It was really interesting this year to see an innovation where the Columbia Journalism School and Center for Public Integrity did a journalism project, which is one of an emerging round of projects where the science gets integrated into the news process, where you're not just going out and interviewing scientists, you're integrating their capacity to do statistical analysis or other work into the reporting, essentially. And Liz Gawthrop, who has deep roots at the Earth Institute, is a journalist who helped to run that project, which is, I think I've got it queued up here. I'll show it again in a minute. Right here, hold on. This is a story about the story, and it's just an interesting innovation. So we'll talk about, conventional journalism. We'll talk about the extent of it, how much reporting is happening compared to reporting on the election and other things, COVID-19. And we'll talk about moving from covering climate now to covering climate how. How much of this is about innovation, how much of it's about capacity. And Genevieve Guenther, who in the run-up to in 2018, right, that interim election, that's when you launched End Climate Silence, right? Initially as a hashtag, I think, right? And as a community and now as an organization. We'll talk about that too. And we'll talk about any questions that come in from those listening out there and watching. So thank you all for being here. So as I said, let's start with Mark. You know, both as a reporter and journalist, or writer and author, and as a wrangler, I guess, you know, through this past year or so, what's your sense of where we are? Maybe you could walk us through a little bit of how covering climate now has changed the landscape.
Thanks, Andy, and it's very nice to be with everybody here today. I'm talking to you from San Francisco, where we have blue skies again, thankfully, after the orange skies of 2 weeks ago from the fires here. So, yeah, as Andy says, you know, I've been covering climate change since almost as long as he has, 1989 in my case. And we're just writing a piece about this yesterday for Columbia Journalism Review. We're running a Q&A with Charles Alexander, who was the editor-in-chief of the special project that Time magazine did back there in 1988-89, where they named, for the first time in history, for their person of the year, instead of picking a person, they picked the endangered planet Earth. And looking back at that period where, you know, you mentioned, Andy, that Jim Hansen had testified in June 24, 1988 to the US Senate saying that man-made climate change had begun. The New York Times ran that story on its front page above the fold, as the old saying went, the next day. And then Time magazine came out a few months later and said endangered planet Earth. And you really had a sense of inertia, of momentum within the media and the political class, which is usually what the media follows. You even had Margaret Thatcher, the arch conservative British Prime Minister, giving speeches in that era about how we have to solve the climate crisis. It doesn't matter what it costs, because we're talking about the home of all people. And what's striking to me is that how quickly that attention on the part of the media drooped. And very soon in the 1990s, as we say in the CGRPs, since then, our record of covering the climate issue has been decidedly mixed. We fell way too, we were much too easily duped by the disinformation campaign coming out of the fossil fuel industry, and the whole idea of false equivalence. We're going to put one scientist up there like Jim Hansen, who's a real scientist, and then on the other side, you'll be interviewing some flack from the fossil fuel industry. So about a year ago, it's actually a year and a half ago now, Covering Climate Now was born. And it was born out of this sense that we really had to do better at this story. And the immediate impulse was the October 2018 landmark scientific report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 1.5 degree report, where they basically said, famous headlines, we have 12 years to cut the emissions in half, or we'll basically have an uninhabitable planet. And the scientists went on to say that in order to do that, to cut those emissions in half in 12 years, we needed radical transformations, unprecedented, in the energy sector, in the finance sector, the construction sector, the agriculture sector, and on and on and on. And the one sector that they didn't mention was the media sector. And I immediately noticed that and thought, well, if we don't transform the media sector, we'll never get those other sectors transformed in time, because there simply won't be the public awareness or the political pressure to make governments and corporations transform, to break the climate silence, as Genevieve's group puts it. And so that's what we set out to do. And Kyle Pope at the Columbia Journalism Review, the editor there, and I started covering climate now at that point. And we did that with the conviction that there were a lot of people in our business who knew darn well that we were blowing this story and that we had to do better. And that if there was a critical mass of those people, and that if we could highlight that critical mass of people and show that it was bigger than people thought, we could also grow that critical mass. So there was a certain amount of faith in our colleagues that we could do better. And that's exactly what's happened. We had our founding conference April 30th, 2019. And within 6 weeks, we had 60 news organizations signed up to try and do nothing more. The only commitment is to do more and better climate coverage. But because we got some big name mainstream organizations like CBS News, like Bloomberg, like the Philadelphia Inquirer, and of course CJR and The Nation, where I am, we picked up momentum quickly. And so last year at this point in September, we had a week of collective coverage, as Andy mentioned. By that time, we had 323 news organizations who were signed on to this in the United States and around the world, combined audience of roughly 1 billion people. And we were sharing content with one another. And I think that we made a real impact, not us alone by any means. We happened to coincide 1 week before the United Nations Climate Action Summit in New York, and of course, the massive climate strikes that the Greta Thunberg and the other young people around the world were holding that week. But I will tell you that our collaborators that week did a total of 3,640 news stories on climate, broadcast, print, digital, etc. That's a lot. And that week, if you look at the Google rankings, climate change, the phrase climate change had never been Googled more than that. So I think we did have some impact, and we have continued since then. We're now over 400 news outlets, and our combined audience is over 2 billion people. And some of the bigger names in news are with us now, in addition to CBS, I mentioned before, NBC, and in addition to the Bloomberg news agency, we now have Reuters, and we have Agence France Presse, and of course they each give content to literally thousands of newsrooms around the world. So I think that we are, to answer your question finally, Andy, I think we are making progress. Kyle Pope and I wrote a piece in our weekly newsletter, The Climate Beat, this week, which we post always at Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation. And we said that the coverage is getting better, but the time is very short. And NBC News in particular is really hitting it out of the park. This week, we had another week of shared coverage. And NBC News is now talking about climate change very directly on the Today Show, on the nightly news show, on their special series, Planet 2020. So I think that we're seeing great improvement on at least one of the major networks. And we list a bunch of the other examples of this, but we also then say that the unfortunate thing is that those stellar examples of great reporting, including a CNN documentary that I think is the single best piece of climate reporting that's been done in the United States in 30 years, called The Road to Change. Add all those up, and it's terrific, but they are still the exception to the rule. Most newsrooms, especially at the big networks, which is still where most Americans get their climate news, they still see the climate story as an afterthought, something marginal to the coverage. And I think that's what we need to change. And the final point there is that next Tuesday is the first presidential debate. And just indefensibly, in my view, Chris Wallace has announced that climate change will not be one of the subjects that he talks to the two people who want to be the next president about. And so that is a sign that in the mainstream media as a whole, climate change is still seen as the sort of the stepchild. And I don't think that's because Chris Wallace is with Fox News. I think it's because most of the most powerful journalists inside of American newsrooms still don't quite get it on climate. I'll stop there. Thanks.
There's much more to say about the politics questions around this for sure, and why. Actually, maybe we'll jump to Genevieve, because in 2018, as was the case in 2016, there was a lot of debate about the debate about the debates and what was or wasn't discussed, and that was one of the elements that prompted the genesis of your citizens' push for more media coverage. So let's just show that, your website. And Genevieve, can you talk a little bit about, as mostly a news consumer and now a voice in social media, how that part of what was just laid out, puts your hair on fire or the like, where do we go next? Why is that still an impediment? Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. So I founded End Climate Silence in 2018 after I had spent some time in the car listening to NPR. And I had heard 3 stories that were clearly about climate change. One about the droughts in the West, which are, ongoing. One about the floods in Japan that displaced over 3 million people that year. And one about self-driving cars and how they're going to transform transportation, which of course didn't mention the need to electrify our transportation system as soon as possible. So it seemed so surreal to me that I heard these 3 stories, which were clearly climate stories, but the announcers never even mentioned the words climate change, that I wrote a Twitter thread about it, which went viral. And Emily Atkin, who at that time was the climate journalist of the New Republic, she now has her own newsletter called Heated, which I recommend to everybody. She picked up the story and picked up the topic of why there was so little climate coverage in the media. So it became a sort of conversation on Twitter. And then Chris Hayes, the MSNBC anchor, weighed in. He was having a conversation with one of his colleagues, and he said, well, look, every time we've tried to do climate stories, it's been a ratings killer for us. And I, boldly and foolhardily perhaps, just intervened into his conversation and said, well, look, maybe the trick is not to do more discrete climate stories, which although, as Mark will tell you, we need those too. But I said at the time, maybe the trick is not to do more discrete climate stories, but to actually mention climate change in the stories you're already telling about its causes and effects. And he responded to me. And he said, that's something that I can do. And within a week, I had decided that this should be my mission for the indefinite future, to just simply try to shift the paradigm for climate coverage from the understanding that it was a science story or an environment story to an understanding that it's actually a story for every beat, that it's emerging in the stories that we're telling about extreme weather, about energy, about immigration, about all sorts of topics that are already being affected and already reproducing and providing feedbacks for climate change. So that's when I founded End Climate Silence. At first I focused on the print news media, and I do feel like I was, not only I, but a whole community of people were able to produce this shift in print journalism and their practices, where I know that memos have been circulated inside newsrooms to people on all sorts of desks, suggesting that they bring climate change into their coverage if it's necessary or if it's part of the story, and providing style guides to do so. So once I felt like this was starting to roll along, I turned our focus to the television news networks. And every technique that I had used to get the attention of journalists and editors utterly failed to get the attention of anchors and TV news producers. They couldn't have cared less what the people on Twitter thought, even if we were right. You cannot appeal to their moral conscience. They don't have a moral conscience. They are beholden to their advertisers. So, I went back to what Chris Hayes said originally, climate coverage is a ratings buffer. And I just thought to myself, wait a minute, is that true? I'm looking at these maps from Yale Climate Communication that shows that increasing numbers of Americans are alarmed and concerned about climate change. I'm looking at other polling that say that for Democrats, it's always in the top 3, if not the top issue that determines their, voting decisions. And I thought, is it really true that people don't want to hear climate news anymore? So End Climate Silence has done some polling. We did polling with Lake Research Partners that we partnered with, but we also have done polling with Data for Progress. And in both these polls, we have found that vast majorities of Americans, including majorities of Republicans, comfortable majorities, over 60%, actually think it's important for the broadcast news media to mention climate change in the stories they're telling about extreme weather. And if there is a scientific link between extreme weather and climate change, people want to hear about it in the news. Also, majorities of Americans, let me make sure I've got this right, 54% of Americans say they would be more likely to use a news program, to consume a news program that covered climate change more frequently. So this seems like really different than what you would expect with the assumption that climate change is a ratings bummer. It's not a ratings bummer according to this polling. And then of course, Yale University just yesterday came out with further results, which show that, which I think were sponsored by Covering Climate Now, Mark, is that correct? Right. And their results showed that a full 79% of Americans want news about what the US government is doing to combat global warming. And 76% specifically want information about what the presidential candidates are going to do in response to global warming. So essentially, instead of trying to sort of shame broadcast journalists for their moral and professional failures, we are now trying to show them that they are actually not delivering viewers to their advertisers because their viewers do want climate news. So this is a very early days strategy. This polling just came out 2 weeks ago, but I had an op-ed in the Boston Globe, which I knew about some play, and I brought it to the attention of some news producers. And I don't know whether it was just the extremity of the wildfires or the fact that Donald Trump went to California and utterly denied that climate change was real in his own just snaky way. But the week of September 14th, there were fully 9 segments on climate change in the primetime network and cable news programs over the course of that week. And that is absolutely unprecedented. They did extended interviews with climate champions like Governor Jerry Brown, like Christine Todd Whitman, who's a Republican who used to be the head of the EPA. And, they talked about climate change in ways that we would recognize. They didn't both sides the issue. They took it for granted that climate change was real and that there was this scientifically established link between the climate breakdown we're experiencing and the extremity of the wildfires in the West. So, I also, like Mark, think that things are starting to shift, not quickly enough. But I've also noticed that Greta Thunberg has started to tweet a lot about climate change in media. And I suspect that she started to feel also, like many of us, that is the key that unlocks so much of the closed door of our politics. Because as Mark was saying, most Americans get their climate news from the news media. We found that a full 60% of Americans first learned about climate change in the news media and get most of their climate news and science and understanding from the news media. And of course, we know that persuadable voters get most of their news from the television networks and from Facebook. So it's super important for us to get them to tell the story accurately and with the urgency it deserves.
So Max, I'm going to get to you in a couple of minutes on the trends and your reading, again, as sort of an analyst of climate media coverage. But I want to get to this idea of innovation a little bit with Liz and with your science partner, Robbie. There's an emerging trend. It's still in the back of the picture, I think. Like 2019, the LA Times did a sea level game, a simulator, along with a major package that was a Pulitzer Prize nominee. So communities could start to actually look at their own coastline and assess what to do or not do based on what they could learn about sea level rise. It's a different approach it's not storytelling, in other words. It's in direct engagement of the media into helping communities examine their climate plight, or their coastal plight in that case. And so, Liz, I wanted to talk to you and Robbie a little bit about your project with others involving the Journalism School and Center for Public Integrity. And let me just add it to the landscape here. So could you just describe a little bit how this came about, Liz? I think I saw a little early stage of it when I was at a faculty meetup with some students at the university a while back. But how did that approach evolve on heat and analysis and climate?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and Robbie, and I'm happy to be here on behalf of also 4 other journalists who worked very hard on this project. So this project started with our editor, Kristen Lombardi, had done a story about Lyme disease in Maine and the CDC's and the state's response to that. Basically discovering this federal program from the CDC that's designed to help state and local health departments adapt to climate, prepare for climate risks. But essentially, it's a very small program, especially compared to the risks at hand. So our job was to tell the story of just how small it was, and to show that in a way that showed the sort of real impacts on people, as well as the sort of politics behind it. And then Robbie sort of came in as a very hands-on science advisor, and then helped us do this sort of complementary story with this bigger story that delved into the link between extreme heat and climate change. Our sort of big story here that you have on the screen was very much, trying to fit in how real people are impacted right now, the sort of Washington level politics, and then the challenges at the state and local levels about actually getting things done. And so there ended up being very little space in that for science. It's hard to fit everything in. And so we ended up doing this piece that came out the same day that sort of explained more the science of why people are vulnerable to heat, how that happens, and then the link between extreme heat and deaths and climate change. I think there wasn't a ton of literature out there about sort of the climate change signal in extreme heat deaths, and so we sort of found that opportunity to do a little bit of original work to complement our more political piece.
And Robbie, could you just explain your academic background and then how you got looped in? And again, this is a novel kind of a relationship. Newsrooms have data journalists now. They have graphics, people who take a paper and translate it into a form that the public can understand. But actually, co-generation of knowledge through a sort of media science interface is pretty new.
Yes, so part of what I found so appealing in working with Elisabeth and the journalism school is my background as an environmental epidemiologist. So I originally was working in climate physics, but then I kind of really wanted to shift into research that would allow people to understand more relevance to their own direct lives. So I started focusing on health. For me, that was an avenue for which I found a much more evocative way to explain the effects of climate change to ways that people could understand in their own lives. And so that was my research path. And so I find myself at the Earth Institute now, mainly doing that in relation to temperature and tropical cyclones and other exposures relevant to health outcomes via sickness or actually death. And I've been, for a few years generating papers that some have been hits, as it were, some have been interesting, picked up by media. But when Elisabeth and her team decided to ask if I was interested in working with them, I found that there was another direct way to explain to people in a completely different form how the data that I would use could be processed in a different way to actually provide insights that would be driven by questions from journalists that they wanted to understand. So rather than sort of taking my paper and then saying, okay, this is the insight that I think is interesting from it, we fundamentally worked together to actually generate answers to questions that we thought were of interest. And so that was what was so appealing to me as a scientist. Now, I'm not saying that's going to replace my work, but it's definitely going to work in concert with it. So that was sort of the background of what I wanted to do here. And I think it speaks to Genevieve's point about sort of needing to make every story pinned to climate change, really, because I found that the more I could talk about the health impacts of climate change, the more people were sort of listening and feeling like they were being touched into their own lives. And actually, it was another leap beyond just writing a paper, which can have a lot of impact, into sort of the journalism sphere, and people would be able to read it in a different way, so it would appeal to a different audience. Because really, my work's all about just trying to maximize the sort of the flow of the message to the right people who want to make a change.
And you know, with when you write a paper, it goes through peer review and the like. And journalism usually gets its peer review after the publication. In other words, we all get hammered or not. And it used to be letters to the editor, and now, of course, it's social media. You know, one way or the other. Great story, or boy, you really screwed up. And so I don't know if there was some hesitation in that sense, because you're kind of
yes.
But can you see a pathway forward here? Is there a way to expand that relationship? And actually, I'm going to ask Mark about that too. You know, this gets to the covering climate how part, as opposed to just more stories. Are there fundamentally new ways to think about what journalism should do?
Well, I mean, just quickly, I would say that part of this is the awareness of scientists that this is a possible route. Mm-hmm. So for me, I felt very fortunate that I was asked, actually, but I don't know that a lot of my colleagues would be necessarily aware that they would be able to sort of work very closely with journalists in this capacity. And I think as awareness improves from scientists and the connections develop, that will certainly increase, because it's a very different. The analyses are, you're right, it's a double-edged sword in that they're not peer reviewed prior to publication, but afterwards, and so there is opportunities to have stuff missed which would have got caught in the peer review. But it's a very powerful tool for getting relatively simple analyses out relatively quickly, and that's especially relevant with the pandemic that we're in right now. Especially at the beginning, that was very relevant. And so
sure.
Yeah, so I see it as more as an awareness thing from scientists. Actually, that's my personal experience.
Well, and we've seen that just briefly. We've seen that with COVID-19 in unbelievable ways. There are a ton of epidemiologists I've had on this show, epidemiologists, virologists, and others who became social media figures almost overnight. Angela Rasmussen at Columbia's virology group had something like 200 followers. Now she's 130,000. and this is in a matter of literally a few months. And so science is thrust now really vigorously into the public sphere. And actually, before Genevieve, I think you had a comment. Or was it Liz? But I wanted to bring Max in on that point of the evolving landscape of how climate and or COVID-19 are interfacing with the public. You know, how much of this is the media's role? It used to be that we were like the only pipeline, right? You know, scientist puts out a paper, university puts out a press release, the New York Times or the Nation writes about it or not. And now it's kind of really changing. So Max, could you kind of give your high level view of all this stuff?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for having me on, and it's great to be on with all of you. It's a great conversation. Starting maybe by trying to answer your question. I mean, I think that, you know, I started in a more formal way examining these interactions about 20 years ago. Got into grad school. Before that, I was actually living in Honduras and encountered Hurricane Mitch in late 1998. And started to ask a number of questions about not only, about human environment interactions, but then also I was fascinated by how my firsthand experiences were at times really contrasting with the international media coverage that I later came to read once I was actually back on U.S. soil. But having looked at this, you know, there used to be these gatekeepers, certainly within traditional legacy media, and it has changed dramatically. And so we see now with this democratization, if you will, of media through things like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, other ways, we can see scientists, epidemiologists, and others speaking directly to people in ways that otherwise weren't possible. I think at the beginning of some of those movements, people really saw it in a hopeful light. This democratization, I think we've certainly seen a lot of the dystopian facets of it, especially in recent years. You know, in terms of the considerations around covering climate now and covering climate how, I think it's really important to be making that distinction. I mean, certainly more coverage can help, seed these spaces can help expose more people to these important intersectional climate challenges. But we also need to look at how these things are being covered. And so that's really driven a lot of my research, not all of it, but a good piece of it going forward. And you know, when I look at it in that way, you may have noticed that I talk about it as a set of intersectional climate challenges. I think one of the mistakes that has been made over time that has made climate coverage vulnerable to getting displaced by other issues is that it can be seen as a single issue, and it really isn't. I mean, as Genevieve has pointed out, as Mark has pointed out, these are questions that thread into all aspects of the ways in which we live, work, play, relax in our lives and livelihoods. And so when we think about it as this intersectional set of challenges, it's not as vulnerable to falling out of the news cycle because it can be threaded into all of these issues. And I also say that another mistake that I think I've seen made over time is a considerable amount of weight placed on journalists themselves. And so, you know, I've been offering critiques, I hope, that are taken in a constructive way, and that's what brought us together originally, Andy, back in 2004. Is that I'm glad that you treated some of the critiques I was making of media coverage of climate change at the time as a way to improve. But I really think that journalists are often swimming upstream against larger political economic currents that a number of you referred to. I mean, that the general structure of corporate profit making that can prompt Chris Hayes to say the things that he said is a manifestation of some real fundamental challenges. And so, you know, as we look at these considerations around new and better coverage, as Mark had said right at the very beginning, we need to be looking very fundamentally at the architectures of media, especially now as we're facing and seeing these manifestations in ecological, meteorological, societal, cultural ways, in addition to what I think we're more accustomed to of seeing in the political, economic, and scientific spaces. I suppose, you know, just specific to the Media and Climate Change Observatory that you've highlighted, Andy, in bringing me in today, it's been a project that's been ongoing for probably about a dozen years. Started it back at the University of Oxford when I was there and brought it with me here to Colorado. But it's really it's a hub with 9 different institutions, universities and institutes with 22 researchers around the world, where we basically are tracking media coverage in radio, television, and newspapers in 120 sources, roughly, across 54 countries, 10 languages. We update these at the beginning of each month. And we provide explainers. We provide summaries as to what is a little bit more of the how behind the ebbs and flows. Right. And so in that, I can see bringing it up that, you know, if you look at, we have 24 open source databases, which makes it, there's plenty of data to play around with. Wow. And we have all kinds of figures. Looking just at the US figure, for instance, though, the Covering Climate Now effort led to the largest spike in coverage since we had been following it in January 2020. The global picture isn't quite as pronounced. Those are the monthly summaries, but you know, Mark's work and that of many others in September 2019, along with other events that were taking place at that time, had led to a tremendous increase. We've also seen, as you get to that, we've also seen a dramatic drop-off. And a lot of that is attributed to the news hole giving way to coverage of coronavirus, coverage of other issues. And so I think, as Genevieve rightly pointed out, that the way in which we can integrate climate elements of these ongoing stories is a way to build a more resilient and sustained conversation that can lead to enhanced engagement and action.
So there's a comment here from Joseph Pupe, who's actually been a frequent guest on our Sunday show, which is music. He's in Lusaka, Zambia, and he says he's read your book, Max, covering creative climate communications. So your book has gotten to Zambia. That's pretty cool.
Fantastic.
And that idea of creativity circles back to the innovations that are being tried that Liz and Robbie were talking about too. There's so many ways to use media now that weren't available couple of decades ago. Genevieve, I think you were sitting on a comment or a question for a while.
I just wanted to jump on the back of something that Max just said, which is how the political landscape challenges these new innovations that you're talking about in climate change reporting. In 2018, which is just 2 years ago, Republican senators, including Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, threatened to investigate the National Science Foundation for funding a program that would train television meteorologists in climate science and climate communication, because they said that government money shouldn't be used to further any political agenda. So the Republicans have so successfully spun climate change as a political agenda that understanding climate change is not seen as a grasp of reality, but the holding of a political opinion, that it has complicated the attempt of many media outlets to cover this as a story about the world, and it's made them afraid that they might be accused of liberal bias. And of course, as Max has written about extensively, one of the ways they've tried to cover their bases is by having a kind of he said, she said approach to representing climate change and covering climate change, which of course elevates climate denial on the same level as climate science. So I think that the Trump administration, I don't quite know where I'm going with this. I do think that the Trump administration's incessant falsehoods have helped journalists across all beats start to realize that they can cover things from the perspective of the truth and not necessarily only from the perspective of bringing different points of view to bear on a particular issue. But I do think that we still need to think a lot about how to reassure journalists that Republicans and people on all sides of the political spectrum are concerned about climate change and want to hear about it in the news, because there is still that fear that they're going to be accused of bias and that their objectivity is going to be somehow compromised if they start talking about climate change as if it were a real thing and an urgent problem.
Yeah, Mark and Max, I want to ask you something related here. In the data, what proportion of the stories, when you see that burst of stories, let's focus on North America, are on the politics? And as we know, political reporters, when they write about climate change, have a really bad habit of doing what all political reporters do, which is take it from the political frame. And it's about winning and losing. It's not about where's the common element here. It's not about the details of how you would expand renewable energy, which we know from Yale work. There's no red and blue states when it comes to the benefits of clean energy. But when the framing is all just because Trump said something, you end up in this back and forth thing. Is that good, or is that simply amplifying a false framing?
Max, why don't you answer first and I'll follow.
Okay. Well, I mean, in certain ways, he is afforded some level of attention in the bully pulpit. And if you were to take some of those same comments and ascribe them to someone sitting in their pajamas in their basement, I don't think they would garner the same attention. And by that, I just mean that these are often outlier perspectives, irrespective of one's left-right politics, and also resisting that this is an inherently political issue. This has become polarized for very deliberate reasons, that when outlier perspectives are brought into the fore, it takes definitely a level of critical analysis and discipline by journalists to determine whether this warrants attention and whether this is something to drive coverage. But we can see that personalities, charisma, certain events drive coverage. We know that, as does conflict. And so when we're talking about these issues, when some people think about them as distant threats in time and space, we as a community need to be doing more to talk about them in the here and now, and to be treating them in a disciplined way in terms of how this affects us all. Certainly it affects others who are at the forefront. One of the cruelties of these intersectional challenges is that those at the forefront of climate impacts are often those that haven't really contributed to the problem to begin with. But when we afford some of those political actors, like you mentioned, the president, to drive the narratives as a left-right, as a merely political challenge, I think that we've come up short in the richness that we ought to be engaging with these issues.
I will briefly say that when you look at COVID-19 as a subset of this bigger issue, you see this Jay Rosen at NYU, another media analyst, has punished the media over and over and over again for getting caught in essentially amplifying exactly what Max was saying. We're trapped by media norms and the way newsrooms are laid out to say, Trump just said this, he's wrong, and ignore the bigger question of public safety and health. And with climate, it feels like the same thing. So, Mark, again, I guess in analyzing the flow over the year, is too much of it or not focused on particular ways of looking at this?
Well, let me get to that in a moment. I want to say first, just on the piece that Robbie and Liz worked on, and this is, I guess, both Covering Climate Now and Covering Climate How, we were very proud at Covering Climate Now to have helped put together the collaboration, the Kristen Lombardi there at Columbia, who was with the Center for Public Integrity. And then we were able to put her together with The Guardian so that the release of that story was had a massively larger impact. And then once it came out in The Guardian and the Center, we were able to say to our 400 plus outlets, hey, here's a great piece of solid reporting. It's free. It's first rate. It's fact checked. It's legally vetted. Take it and run with it. So I think that, getting back to your theme, Andy, of innovation, that's one of the very basic innovations, just collaboration that we need a lot more of in the media. And you talked about norms. For so many years, we in the media have been against collaboration. And we seem to care a great deal about who gets story X 2 minutes before anybody else. And we kid ourselves that this is about our audience. And we need to get past that. It's been about our egos mainly. And we need to get past that. This idea that somehow it really matters who gets the piece 5 minutes before, or if it's appeared someplace else. Oh, I can't possibly run that. That's about ego that we have to transcend. Collaboration is essential now, especially because of something else that I think has not gotten enough attention,
right? Which
is that nobody wants to pay for media anymore. So the revenue system for all media outside of television, television is still pretty solid, especially at the local level. They have plenty of revenues. But the rest of the media, nobody wants to pay for it. And so everybody that I know, and I talk to a lot of newsrooms now, pretty much everybody in every newsroom was already before COVID doing at least 1.5, if not 2 jobs that they last year would have been 1. Right. Then comes COVID. And as we've seen in Max's data there, the coverage fell off a cliff. And that's understandable in a way. And at Covering Climate Now, we've worked a lot to try and show the intersectionality. And we kept on with one of our weeks around Earth Day. We had another coverage week of dedicated coverage, precisely because we wanted people to understand that, yes, COVID is big, but guess what? There's a bigger one out there, and we have to talk about it. But we do have to talk about these structural issues again, that if we believe that people don't have to pay for media and we don't want to support public media, then you're going to get what you have today, which is a lot of people who are not informed, and a lot of newsrooms who are just frankly exhausted. They're just exhausted. I mean, I'm not going to give specifics, but we have some terrific story ideas that we shared with big news organizations, and everybody said, love the idea. That's a great story. We literally don't have a reporter who can do it. Can you get somebody else who'll do it, and then we'll run it? So we've got to talk about those structural things. And then finally, one last point, which is I'm very glad that we've talked a little bit here about outside of the US, and that Max's data comes from outside of the US. A lot of the problems that we're talking about here today are quite specific, or at least much accentuated here in the United States. I've been fortunate in my career to spend a lot of my time overseas. And every time I came back, and I've reported from 25 countries on climate change, every time I came back to the United States, from the 1990s up through almost till today, it was unmistakable that the climate conversation within the media and the political classes in the United States was 10 years behind what was going on in Europe. Mm-hmm. You know, in Europe, in the 1990s, there was no more talk about, oh, maybe the science isn't real. Even right-wing governments didn't dispute the science. They talked about, you know, what do we do about it, but not disputing the science. And so I think we have to sort of be more specific in our analysis and to understand why is that different in the United States. And that's a whole other topic, but I'll tell you quickly, one of the reasons is that, A, we don't have as strong of a commitment to public media, to publicly funded media. Yeah. But even more important, the United States is a petrostate, and it has been for 100 years. Petroleum has been the basis of American wealth, American power. We won World War II, not in a small way because we had oil and the Germans and the Japanese didn't. And oil was what led us to build our suburbs and our superhighway system after World War II and start the biggest economic boom in human history. So there's a lot of interests in this country that want oil to continue. I think oil is on the way down now, but there's a long historical overhang. So all of these structural factors are things that we really have to bear in mind. And somebody said earlier that there's a lot of pressure being put on journalists. And I think that that's true. And I speak for my fellow journalists here, even though I'm often criticizing what we as an institution do. I'm very aware that there are many, as we said at the start, you know, the reason we started covering climate now is we knew there were a lot of journalists out there who are good journalists and who knew we were missing this story and we needed to do better. But alone, we can't do it. So we need to get after some of these structural issues, or we're really not going to make the progress that we need in the time that we need to make it.
I want to bring Liz and Robbie back in as we come toward the end. By the way, we can go a little long. If any of you can stay on after the turn of the hour, let me know, because this is important. I don't want to let go of these questions. And Bernadette Plackey at Climate Central posted something here. You're covering some important points, but I'd also like to hear you talk about the importance of local news in the news ecosystem and climate news ecosystem. I mean, Mark, you got at that a little bit with that idea of a sharing ecosystem. Just last week, I did a session on The Conversation, which is an innovative website publishing scholars' work on these issues. And it's all Creative Commons. Their stuff goes through Yahoo News and the AP. And what you're talking
about. And covering climate now.
Yeah, well, right. So then that seems to be a way to fill that gap. But does it, maybe before we get to Liz and Robbie, Max, do you have a quick comment on that local news hole, the gap there, if that is true?
Yeah, I think Bernadette's comment's wonderful. She is involved with great collaboration at Climate Central and Climate Matters, working in particular, say, with local weathercasters. And they're really seen as trusted figures, even nowadays within these communities. And so they are great. They are great communicators, potentially, of climate change. And so she and her group have done wonderful work. Susan Hassel has also done.
Yeah, I'm just showing from a tweet this morning. I'm showing a couple of the resources for those who want to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take too much time on this, but just to say that Mark's comment about, overworked and exhausted newsrooms is definitely something that these journalists have been operating over capacity and being asked to do more and more all the time. And that's where the kinds of innovations that Liz and Robbie are talking about, that Mark's talking about through the coordination, through Covering Climate Now, that Genevieve has talked about through her work, is what really helps broaden out the collective responsibility of sustaining these conversations in a much more significant way. And so, I'm involved in a project here inside the greenhouse around creative climate communications. I wrote that book that I'm really happy got its way to Zambia. That, these are the ways to me that show there isn't going to be a silver bullet that's going to sort this out. It's going to take all of us doing what we can from playing to our strengths in order to address this together.
Andy, can I just say really quickly before you go to Liz, The climate central work that Bernadette is doing is really valuable. They have turned around the opinion at local news stations all across the country among meteorologists. And why is that important? 5 years ago, meteorologists basically were climate skeptics. Now that has shifted entirely in the last 5 years, largely because of the work of Climate Central and going to them and saying, hey, you guys are scientists. Let us show you the scientists. Let us show you the science. And why that's important is that local TV stations still do have revenues, and they are by far the most trusted news source in America. People trust their local television, especially about weather, and no one do they trust more than their local meteorologist. So that's a really strategic insight that I think that Climate Central had, and a very fertile area for us to continue working. In fact, that's where Covering Climate Now hopes to do a lot of work in the year 2021.
That's good. And so you're going on. I know you had a 1-year grant initially. So Covering Climate Now is a running operation?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's great. So Liz, you've been very patient, and I want to get back to the innovation question and, your general view of this landscape of opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, well, Mark was mentioning how there's been barriers towards collaboration within journalism. But I think there's also barriers with scientists and journalists collaborating, which we were able to overcome here. But, scientists, and Robbie can speak more to this, but they're generally not incentivized to, spend too much time with media. Certainly getting a quote is good, and scientists may in some places be rewarded for that. But the sort of time that Robbie put in is typically not something that you can sort of use in your career progression, is my understanding. And so in terms of the practicalities for us, we had some great conversations with experts across Columbia, but I think it's PhD students and postdocs tend to have more flexibility with their time to do things like this. And again, Robbie can speak more to that, but and that's a generalization, of course, but my suggestion to any journalists who might want to do a science collaboration is to find some people in those positions, because you can still do really good science. You don't have to have the sort of, high-ranking big name to do something that matters. And then also you had mentioned the peer review and that sort of scariness. And I did want to mention that we talked quite a bit with David Handula, who's a scientist at Arizona State, for our story. And we did run our model by him and ended up having like a conversation with the three of us, Robbie, him and I. So he put in a couple hours probably of time too, not what maybe a peer review process would be, but there was some sort of sanity check involved at least. And so, that was also someone's real time and resources.
Well, certainly at Columbia, the Earth Institute, especially now that Columbia is committed to building a climate school. And the climate school is not just climate. It's not a climate science school. It's a school of the climate problem, the climate question. And there's going to be a big focus on creating more effective interfaces between the disciplines, like social work is part of the innovation pool we have. Engineering, law, they're all going to be crossing borders. And a big chunk of this is the outward-facing innovation as well, getting scientists to interlace more creatively with journalists, artists, and people like Genevieve, who's writing a book on the language of climate change. I want to keep track of that as well as we go forward. Robbie, do you have a last thought on that question? For a young scholar, not yet tenure, I think this feels like, I know a lot of the young people I know are very eager to get into this issue in ways that actually matter in the world, right? And there's that urgency factor. Is that
Yep.
Am I imagining that correctly?
You are. I think Elisabeth summarized it very, very well, that the incentives are sometimes seen as not there for this kind of collaboration, largely because science and science career progression has evolved, but largely people care about your citation count. They might care about And this is talking about fundamentally at science at universities and how the hiring process is. That's why we're so concerned about citation counts, because that's what they generally use to see how your validity as a scientist. And I want citations just as much as next scientist. But what is fundamentally important is that this gets recognized in the same way, but in a complementary. As a complementary way to get the message out, because scientists, as part of fundamentally what we're trying to do is to try and reveal information and get that information to who needs to hear it. And so this can be an alternative and effective way, but there is that lack at the moment of incentive. And Elisabeth was talking about postdocs and PhDs having more time. I think all levels of academia are sort of overstretched, and I do think it is a struggle even now to sort of prioritize this, because it does take quite a lot of time. So largely I'll just echo Elisabeth's comments there, that if there could be a section in an application or for your next career progression from a science point of view to really feel that this is actually very, very important and critical to your career progression.
Well, and I'm encouraged here.
Wonderful.
We have people like Francesco Fiandella, who just got a grant from the Brown Institute for Media Innovation to create what he calls a climate data concierge. Essentially, the word is kind of funny, but it's a way to have a very smooth interface. So a journalist who's looking for heat data in Arizona or in Angola has a quick way of connecting with scientists who might have the data. And those interfaces, the people who are those interfaces are a very special crew. There are people who work on that right now between the Earth Institute and Bangladesh, for example, on cyclone risk and evacuation plans. And I just feel we're at the early stages here of getting to what Mark was talking about, which is this the capacity for networked communicative innovation, lubrication, innovation. I'd like to get maybe one more round from each of you, if you can hang for another couple of minutes. Excuse me. And Genevieve, again, the voice of the audience, perhaps. What's your takeaway message here in terms of next steps?
Well, I think in terms of next steps, as we develop these nodes of interface, these points of interface between science and journalists, I think it's going to be important for people to understand that the language of science doesn't always communicate to the general public in the ways that scientists understand it. So, this is a very old standing example, but scientific uncertainty, for example. To the general public, uncertainty means the state of not knowing, of not having enough information to be sure. And to climate scientists, at least one thing it means is confidence, honestly.
Right.
You can talk about an uncertainty interval for a projection, meaning we are confident that what's going to happen is going to fall into this particular range of outcomes. But that outcome is also called the uncertainty interval. But the uncertainty interval is paradoxically based in confidence. And I feel like one thing that's going to happen is journalists need to do better thinking about how those terms, as they cycle through the media sphere, actually are heard by audiences. I think that one of the reasons that fossil fuel interests played up scientific uncertainty so long and so successfully was that nobody really came out and said, look, it means this to scientists, but it means this to us. And so anytime anyone was asked about scientific uncertainty, it just made it seem like scientists weren't really sure about their own findings. So I think that kind of work on language is going to be part of this moving forward as these innovative networks are put into these points of interface. So, hopefully I can help that.
I'm hopeful that you're right about that. In 2010, the IPCC hired some communication consultants, and I wrote about this at the time. They were given a list of words the communication consultants recommended they don't use, and the words included risk, uncertainty, And to me personally, I think it's the inverse that would be the thing to get out there and say, when we talk about uncertainty, we're talking about a bounded chunk of knowledge.
That's right.
Plus or minus X is knowledge.
That's right. It's not about reframing. It's about actually explaining. I mean, that's the professor in me talking, but I really believe that journalists can do this, that they're equipped to act as that mediating force between scientists and the general public.
Well, Max, do you have a sort of from the standpoint of someone who's written about creative climate communication and is tracking both the mass and nature of journalism in this arena, what's our next step? If we were to reconvene in 2 months and say, how are we doing? What would be the thing you'd want us to be thinking about?
Well, I mean, distilling this into a few key pieces, I think we ought to really focus in on how creative we're being, which can afford us these spaces of innovation that have been discussed. Even just, taking a half step back and thinking about your program here. And sustain what? It's just a creative opportunity for us to reflect meaningfully with those who are tuning in. Creativity is one. And number two is greater coordination. I think Mark's effort and many others have been showing this. And then third, at the risk of being brash and impolite, cash is important. We, as social sciences and humanities scholars, as well as practitioners, we have made a lot of progress on shoestring budgets. And speaking on behalf of others and also understanding it firsthand myself, that while we've gained a lot of important insights into the natural physical sciences through large-scale projects, when you contrast that with what we are trying to do to better communicate and understand human behavior and understand attitudes and perspectives, it is sorely underfunded, and this needs to change. So that's creativity, coordination, and cash.
Journalism needs to be funded as well. As Mark was saying, the overwhelming nature of this story is just one aspect of the pressures on the newsroom. The shrinkage of newsrooms of basic capacity is huge. So anything that can happen that can disperse capacity can create that, whether it's a module like what Climate Central does, or just a connectivity so the local newspaper or radio station can get a climate scientist onto the air, on the website, feels like a fundamental thing going forward. Mark, your last, again, if we meet in another couple of months, which I think we should do regularly, actually, here, have another session, what can we do between here and then to get some more traction on these challenges?
In a couple of months, we're going to know the answer to what is arguably the most important question about our climate future, which is, will we still have the Trump administration and a Republican Senate? I'm doing a piece right now for The Guardian that quotes one of the great scientists right now and a real model for someone who is able to speak to the general public, Michael Mann of Penn State, who is just a natural at this. And Michael says the thrust of this piece is a statement that he's made that we're going to be exploring, that, quote, if 4 more years of Donald Trump would mean game over for the climate, unquote, which he hastens to add is not a political statement. It is a scientific statement with political implications. And I think that that is a message that we need to be getting out. Right now, Uncovering Climate Now is doing all it can to get that out. It's not about whether you like Donald Trump as a president or not. It's about science and the fact that if we do indeed have to cut the emissions in half by 2030, we cannot spend the next 4 years continuing to go in the wrong direction. So it is a scientific statement with political implications. And that leads me to my final point, which is that as important as innovation is, and science, at this point, what we really need is the oldest innovation, I suppose, in human history, which is storytelling. That's how we humans make sense of our world. We tell one another stories, whether it's parent to child, sibling to sibling, inside of households, inside of workplaces, inside of your own head. We tell ourselves stories. And so much of the dialogue around climate change for 30 years has been so focused on science. that I'm sorry, most people don't think that way. They don't process the world up here. They process it down here in their heart and their guts. And we need to remember that as we talk to them and use the oldest storytelling techniques that we know. And that's what journalists are to do. We're supposed to translate science. We're supposed to translate what politicians say into a language that ordinary people can understand. We're good at that when we put our minds to it. And so I think that's really what I would hope that we would focus on going forward. As much as we innovate, that we remember tradition as well.
Yep. This is a great way to close out this session. And again, it's chapter 1, I think. I invented Sustain What March 15th in the middle of the lockdown. And the idea here is all iteration, and conversation is a key part of storytelling to me. After 35 years of writing pieces and floating them out there, it's all about the fundamental nature of the word communication. When you look at the heart of that word is commune, and communing. If you look at any dictionary definition, gets to Genevieve's wonderful approach to words. Virtually every one is about an exchange of information. So storytelling is implicitly listening as well, knowing the audience, engaging with the question. Which audience for the question is the audience? The politics is a vital juncture right now, and that's a key part of the climate conversation. And then there's the vulnerability reduction. None of this matters if you want to stem risks from wildfires in the West. The CO2 part is a long-term trajectory that will not reduce wildfires or flooding or anything for the next few decades. So that's another story to tell. And I think it was Max or someone who said this is a multifold storytelling landscape and story sharing landscape. So thanks everybody for being here today. On Sunday, as Genevieve, you were on one of the Sunday shows, I think, right? Or the one
I
with
was.
Reggie Harris.
And he is
Sunday mornings.
So inspiring.
It's the way of casting the conversation every once a week back into storytelling in the more fundamental way. It's poetry and songs. This Sunday, the usual array of guests will be there, and they've been spectacular. On Monday, have a young woman from Zambia who'll be on to describe work she's doing to achieve the SDG for hunger, nutrition, by telling stories and creating a network community around that part of Africa. And on we go. This Sustain What webcast is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration, which is essentially the last 50 years of our experience on this planet. The Zoom part that jogged the climate out of balance, and that's created such stresses around the world. Now we're in the great pause enforced by this virus, and getting out of it takes a lot of conversation, a lot of innovation. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. The great part of it is we're all connecting now that way, wherever you are. The hard part is it's full of disinformation and noise at the same time. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment, so we better figure it out. The webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, please share the link you've been watching on with friends in circles far and wide. Get in touch with ideas for future episodes. We will definitely do more on this. I hope everyone here can come back on again. And see the scrolling info at the bottom of the screen for how to get in touch. Thanks again for watching. And here's the general information on what we're doing. Thanks to Max, to Genevieve, to Liz, to Robbie, Mark, and to all of you who are listening out there. Please get in touch and do your part to communicate, to commune around solving these problems. Thank you all for listening today.